Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shabbos Daf Kuf Beis is divided neatly in half by the end of Perek HaZoyrik, the 11th chapter of Masechta Shabbos, and the beginning of the 12th. The first half of the Daf has three discussions. The first one is about somebody who performs an Isser, a Malacha on Shabbos, but only part of it was b'shoigeg, was accidental, the rest of it was on purpose. Does he have to make a carbon chatas? This next discussion is what if there was three parts to his Malacha. It was b'shoigeg, then b'mezid, and then b'shoigeg. And the third part is what happens if half his Malacha was done properly and the other half was intercepted. We begin the first half of the daf with a Mishnah which discusses two cases and a general rule, all on the subject of somebody who performs a malacha, but in the beginning of the malacha he was b'shagi, he was accidental, he didn't realize that it was Shabbos, and then midway through the malacha he realized that it was Shabbos, and the rest of the malacha was b'mezid, meaning he did it on purpose. Now the halacha generally is that you can only bring a karban chadas to atone for a malacha that you did if it was done accidentally. It was b'shogeg, like for example you didn't know that it was Shabbos. This person remembered that it was Shabbos in the middle of the malachas being performed. So the Mishnah has two cases and a general rule. The first case seems to contradict the second case, and the second case fits with the general rule which is afterwards. So the Gemara is going to try to figure it out, and the Gemara will have three different explanations as to how the Mishnah all fits together and makes sense. So first of all, we're discussing somebody who throws an object on Shabbos. In the first case, the Isser that happens is that he's transferring 4 Amos in Rosh Hashanah. In the second case, the Isser that happens has nothing to do with transferring. It's he's throwing it so that it hits an animal or a person and makes a wound. Now, making a wound is also a malacha on Shabbos. So the general rule which comes afterwards is as follows. A person can only bring a karban chatos if the entire malacha was performed in a situation in which he was unaware that it was Asr. He did not know that it was Shabbos. That's when he can bring a karban chatos. If, however, part of the malacha, he knew it was Shabbos and he knew it was Asr and it's forbidden, he cannot bring a karban chatos for that. Now, the first case says as follows. It says that he threw an object, and while it was flying in the air, he remembered that it was Shabbos, and then somebody else came and caught it. He ran forward and intercepted it, or a dog caught it, or it was burned in a fire, so it never landed. So then, in a situation like this, he can't bring a karban chatas. Now, this implies the opposite of what the rule said. This implies that the only reason why he can't bring a karban chatas in all these cases is because the object never landed. Had the object landed properly, the fact that he remembered in midair that it was Shabbos does not mean that he doesn't bring a karban chatas. The Gemara is going to ask that this obviously conflicts with the rule. Now, the Mishnah's second case fits neatly with the rule, and that is where somebody threw an object in order to create a wound. That's an Isser of Shabbos, but he remembered in midair that it was Shabbos, so then he doesn't bring a karban chatas because by the time the object landed, he didn't realize that he had realized that it was Shabbos and it was not a shogeg anymore. Okay, so the Gemara asks, how does this fit? The first case clearly shows that the only reason the person is not bringing a karban chatas is because the object never landed. Somebody intercepted it, and he's less than he's responsible for the landing of it, or the object was caught in the mouth of a dog. The dog is not for tfachim wide, or it fell into a fire, which is not for tfachim wide. So the object never landed, but it seems to clearly imply that had the object landed, even though he remembered in midair, he would be able to bring a karban chatas. So how does that fit with the rule? So the Gemara is going to give three explanations. The Gemara's first explanation is that you really got the rule wrong. It's really the other way. In truth, if any part of a malacha was performed b'shoigeg, the person did not realize that it was Shabbos, then he brings a karban chatas. You do not have to have the entire thing be in shoigeg in order to be able to bring a chatas. Now, the truth is, the Mishnah's rule says otherwise. That's because the Mishnah's rule is referring to a case where somebody threw an object with a rope attached to it, and he kept the rope in his hand the entire time. The example of Kahana gives is some sort of device which is used to help support barrels of wine on the back of a animal. So it's got a rope on it. So you're holding onto the rope. Now, if that's the situation, so you're not actually considered to have thrown the object until you release the rope. This person held on to the rope the entire time. He could have jerked it back towards him at any moment. So until it lands, he didn't do any malacha at all. Nothing happened. So if he were to remember in the middle of the case, while the object is flying, if he were to remember that it's Shabbos, then the entire malacha would be b'mezid. Therefore, the Mishnah says it has to be that it lands when he still is unaware that it's Shabbos. That was the only way that it can be shaky. The entire malacha happens in the instant that it lands, because as long as he's throwing it, he's still holding it, really, because he's still holding on to the rope. Because while it's flying, he's still holding it. So when it lands, that is the instant in which the akira, the transferring, and the hanacha happens all at once, and therefore at that moment he still has to have forgotten that it's Shabbos in order for it to be considered a shogeg. The entire malacha there happens, therefore the entire thing has to be shogeg. If, however, part of the malacha would be performed when it was b'shogeg, that would be enough to make him be able to bring a chiyuv chatas. And that's why the Mishnah's first case is not a problem. In the first case, he threw it. When he threw it, he didn't realize it was Shabbos. That's enough. He's chayiv chatas. If a dog came and caught it, or a person caught it, or if it fell in the fire, then he doesn't make a chatas because it never landed. Now, the Gemara is going to discuss this and have a few problems with it, and the Gemara is going to end up with two other answers. First of all, the Gemara says it can't be the case. Because if he's holding on to the rope, then he never did an isser. He's holding it, it never flew, it never fell anywhere. So, there's no isser here. What are you talking about? He has to leave his hand in order for it to be an isser. So the Gemara says, no, I was referring to the case where he threw it in order to hit somebody. There, he didn't do anything until it actually strikes the person or the animal that it was meant to hit, because he could always jerk it back to the last instant. So the entire malacha is at that last instant. So the Gemara says, how could that be the case of the rule? That's the second case. The Mishnah says the case explicitly. The rule has to be including other things. That can't be the rule. So the Gemara says, okay, we'll change the answer. It's the same idea, but it's a different case. It's not with a rope that he could have pulled back. It's somebody who's walking. He's carrying an object 4 amas through Rishos Harabim. He didn't throw anything. Now, as long as he's walking, if he were to remember that it was Shabbos at any moment, the malacha would not be completed. The malacha is only completed by him when he remembers, when he carries it 4 amas, he completes the 4 amma walk. If he were to remember in between, the malacha never happens. So the entire malacha is considered to be happening at that last moment, and that's why it has to be that he was b'shogeg at that last moment. If he were to remember in the middle, then it would be no part of this malacha would be b'shogeg, and therefore he would not be able to bring a carbon chatas. So the Gemara says that can't be either, because why would the Mishnah say a general rule on a Mishnah that's talking about throwing, and the general rule is not talking about throwing? The first case and the second case in the Mishnah are talking about throwing. And then you tell me a general rule is not talking about throwing, it's talking about carrying. That can't be. It doesn't belong here. So because of all this, the Gemara shifts to its second answer, which is the complete opposite of what we are understanding up to now, and the rule is really correct. The rule is that if any part of the malacha was not b'shogeg, there is no carbon chatas. The entire malacha from beginning to end has to all be done by accident b'shogeg without realizing that it was Shabbos in order to be able to bring a carbon chatas. How do you understand it? As follows. The first case of the Mishnah is meant to be split into separate cases. If a person threw an object and he remembered in midair that it's Shabbos, or he didn't remember, but a dog came and caught it, or a person came and caught it, or it landed in a fire, any of these cases he doesn't bring a carbon chatas, and therefore the first case stands alone. He remembered in midair, doesn't bring a chatas because it's not completely done b'shogeg. Now, that's the first explanation. Rav Ashi gives a third explanation, which holds of the same principle but answers it differently. He says the first case of the Mishnah is really referring to one long thing. Somebody threw it, and then he remembered that it was Shabbos, and then a dog came in and caught it. But you have to add in words here. The reason why he's only not able to bring a carbon chatas because the dog came and caught it is because he remembered in midair again, he forgot in midair again that it was Shabbos, and therefore he goes back to a situation of shogeg. The malacha began b'shogeg and ended b'shogeg. In the middle he remembered. However, had he really remembered in the middle that it was Shabbos and not forgotten again, then he would not be able to bring a karban chatas. He would be parted from karban chatas even if a dog didn't come and catch it. Now, the Gemara refers back to the Mishnah and discusses this halacha more at length, where somebody forgot that it was Shabbos in the beginning of the malacha and the end of the malacha, but he remembered in the middle. The case that the Gemara discusses is where a person moved an object 6 amas in Rosh Hashanah. The first 2 amas were b'shogeg, the last 2 amas were b'shogeg, but the middle 2 amas were b'mezid. He knew it was Shabbos and he moved it anyway. Now, the Gemara compares this to a machlokes between Rabbi Gamliel and the Rabbanan in a situation where somebody is writing 2 letters. He wrote the first letter b'shogeg, then he remembered it was Shabbos, then he forgot it was Shabbos, and he wrote the second letter again b'shogeg. That case is a machlokes between Rabbi Gamliel and the Rabbanan as to whether or not the 2 actions of writing 1 letter each combine to one total malacha if he remembered in between the 2 letters. All right, the question there is, do we say that the moment of remembering between divides it into 2 separate actions? Each action is therefore separate. They can't combine. Each one's only 1 letter, and they can't combine. You do not have the minimum amount to be mechayev you a karban chatas, which is 2 letters. Now the Gemara says in this case, where he walked 2 amas b'shogeg, 2 b'mezid, and 2 b'shogeg, here it's different. And the Gemara quotes Rabbah and Rava. And they say that here everybody will agree that it depends on how he transferred the object. If he walked it all 6 amas, then everybody will agree that in this case there is no chiyuv chatas. Why? Because when he completed the minimum amount for carrying, he did it b'mezid. The first 2 amas were done on purpose. The next 2 amas is when he completed the transfer. Those last 2 amas were done b'mezid, not b'shogeg, so therefore there is no chiyuv chatas there. It's not like the case of the letters where the second letter was written also b'shogeg. Now, if however you threw it, so then everybody will agree that there is a chiyuv chatas here, and the first 2 amas will combine with the last 2 amas. Why? Because it's not like the case of the letter. In the case of the letter, he had 2 decisions. He had a decision to write the first letter and a decision to write the second letter. Those 2 decisions were split up by a remembering in between, and they don't combine. Here he only had 1 decision. He threw it. He threw the object. That was the 1 decision. That 1 decision produced 4 amas of transfer b'shogeg. Okay, there were 2 amas in between that weren't b'shogeg. Fine. Who cares about that? The decision is not split up by what changed between the first 2 amas and the last 2 amas. His 1 decision is uniform, and therefore it all combines into 1 action, and he is chayav according to all opinions. The Gemara's third discussion now begins, which is when he threw an object and it landed in a dog's mouth or in a fire. So the Gemara says that is a significant place, and therefore the person's chayav. Even though it's not 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim, it is significant, and therefore it counts as 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim, and he has violated the Yisur D'Oraisa. The Gemara says, what do you mean? Our Mishnah said the opposite. So the Gemara says the Mishnah was talking about where he did not intend for it to land there, and therefore it's not made significant. If he intended for it to land there, it becomes a significant place by his intent, and the fact that it lands there therefore makes him do a complete hanacha, a complete bringing of the object to rest in a significant place, and it is an Isser D'Oraisa complete. Now the Gemara says, I'm going to show you this principle that a person's intent makes something significant. So it's Rav Bivi Bar Abaye says we have a Mishnah discussing somebody who eats a single kizayis, a single olive size of food, and he gets 4 karban chatases and 1 asham for that. What is that? He's a tamei person who ate kachim, which was chaylev, forbidden fats. So it was tamei eating a karbanis and forbidden fats, and it was left over from a karban, that's another one, and it was on Yom Kippur. Reb Meir says you can add another one. If he was chewing as he went from one rishus to another rishus, he did an isser of carrying, and therefore he has to bring another chatas for that. So they said to him, okay, that's not the same type as these, so that's why we're not including it. So now the Gemara says, why is it that carrying in his mouth is called carrying? That's not a normal way of holding an object. But because he's intending to eat it and he wants it to be in his mouth, therefore it's considered normal. So you see here also in the case of the dog's mouth or the fire, since you want it to land there, it is considered normal. This is the end of Parak HaZoyrik, and now we begin Parak HaBoineh, which shifts from the malachos of carrying to the malacha of building. So we'll begin with the Mishnah, which discusses two very similar and related halachos, that of building and makabah patish, completing. And then we'll have a few examples of them, and then the Mishnah will give a general rule which applies to all malachos. The Gemara will give the minimum size for the malacha of building and discuss how you define certain activities, whether they're makabah patish or building. So first of all, we need to know what building and makabah patish are. Building is when you build something, you create a structure of any sort. We will see how it's more clearly defined later. Makabah patish is when you finish anything off. You have an object and you finish off the final step, which transfers it from non-complete to completed. That's makabah patish. Now sometimes these malachos overlap, as we shall see. So first of all, the Mishnah begins and the Mishnah says, what is the minimum size for building? And the Mishnah says any amount. Now, misates, that's somebody who squares off a stone. That means he's making a brick out of a mountain. He's chiseling it off the mountain, and he squares it off. That's a malacha. Also, the Gemara will ask which one. Next is somebody who's makabah patish. He strikes the last blow on a stone. This could be that he's knocking the stone off the mountainside. Somebody who drills a hole, also any amount. All these malachos are malachos, toldos of either boina or makabah patish, and they are any amount. Now here's a rule. The rule is that any malacha that somebody is doing has to be the end of something. It has to be a significant step of some source to somebody out there. Even if he himself doesn't consider anything finished, it's got to be a significant step which lasts. Now, Rishon Gamliel says even if he's just working with a hammer and he accidentally hits his anvil instead of the thing he's working on, that still counts as a malacha. The Gemara will explain that. So first of all, the Gemara says, you told me that for building, any size counts. What exactly is a tiny size of building? What is that useful for? So the Gemara has a couple of opinions here. First of all, Rav Yirmiyah says, because a poor person may dig a small hole, which is building a hole, if it's in a house, in order to hide his money. And the same thing happened in the Mishkan, that the people who sewed the Urias would hide their needles. So Gemara says, no, that's not true. They wouldn't do that because they become rusty. So Abaye says it's something else. It's that you would make a small stand to hold a tiny pot to cook your food over the stove. And in the Mishkan, they did that also because they needed to cook up the plants that they used to make the dyes, in case they ran out of dye and they needed a small amount. Someone says, no, they never did things like that in the Mishkan. That is the action of poor people. In the Mishkan, they didn't do anything that poor people do. What the smallest building is if somebody has a big house and it gets a hole in the wall, so he'll seal up the tiny hole. Same thing happened in the Mishkan. They would sometimes get a hole when a worm fell on a piece of wood and they would seal it up. So that sealing is a tiny amount. That's something that people would do. It's considered significant, and therefore it's a malacha. Okay, now the Gemara discusses what is exactly building of placing a stone in the ground. So the Gemara first of all says, Shmuel says that if you position a stone in the right place, you move it around, you knock it on the side so that it's in the exact right spot, even without cement, that's a malacha. The Gemara says, 1 second, I have a brayso that says you have to cement it. So the Gemara says, but later in the brayso it says you don't even have to cement it, you don't even have to position it, you just have to place it on the row. So what's going on? We have three things. So the Gemara says, yes, that's correct. There are three types of building for three types of stones. The bottom row of stones, the middle row of stones, and the upper row of stones in a wall are considered to be building differently. It works as follows. The bottom row needs to be positioned in the ground. You have to move it into the right spot. The middle row needs to be cemented, and the top row just has to be placed there. And that's how you perform each of these malacha. Okay, now the Gemara says the malacha of mesate, squaring off the stone. What is that? The Gemara is going to have a few related machlokes. So the Gemara says Rav and Shmuel. Rav says that it's building. Shmuel says that it's makabah patish, striking the final blow. Similarly, somebody who made a chicken coop, which is pretty much a wooden crate, but then he has to make holes in it so that the chickens can have some fresh air. So the making of the holes, what's that? Rav says it's building. Shmuel says makabah patish. And the third one is somebody who connects a handle to a hoe. He connects the blade to the stick by inserting a peg in a hole where they meet. So again, Rav says that it's building, and Shmuel says that it's makeh b'patish. The Gemara asks, why do I need all these three cases? Why couldn't they just say they're machlokes in one and to figure out the other ones? The Gemara says because each of the three has a different level of similarity to the malacha of building. Squaring off a brick is a normal part of the building process. Making holes in things is not really a normal part of building. However, it is somewhat similar. People do make windows in a house, just like they make holes in a chicken coop. But connecting a blade to a hoe handle via a stick is not like building at all. So if I would only say the first case, then I would think that Rav says that's building, but not the second one. If I would say the second, I would think Rav says that those two are called building, but not the third one. And if I would only say the third one, I would think Shmuel says that case is makeh b'patish, but not the first two, because they are more like building. Therefore, I have to say all three. Okay, now the Gemara goes back to the machlokes about misates, squaring off the stone. What is that? So the Gemara says that Rav Nosson bar Ashi asked Rav Yechanan which malacha is that, and Rav Yechanan made a motion to show that it's makeh b'patish. He hit his hand with his fist. So the Gemara says that Rav Nosson bar Ashi asked, but what do you mean? Look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah says ha-misates v'ha-makeh b'patish. That means there's two separate things. Misates is one malacha, makeh b'patish is another one. So Rav Yechanan said, adjust the Mishnah ha-misates ha-makeh b'patish. Take out the vav, and misates is a makeh b'patish. Okay, the Gemara will continue discussing this on the Daf Kuf Gimel, which we shall get to.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.